Most dangerous superstition. Page 15, The Myth of Consent. In the modern world, slavery is almost universally condemned, but the relationship of perceived authority to a subject is very much the relationship of a slave master, owner, to a slave, property. Not wanting to admit that, and not wanting to condone what amounts to slavery, those who believe in authority are trained to memorize and repeat blatantly inaccurate rhetoric designed to hide the true nature of the situation. One example of this is the phrase, consent of the governed. There are two basic ways in which people can interact, by mutual agreement or by one person using threats of violence or force to force his will upon another. The first can be labeled consent, both sides willingly and voluntarily agreeing to what is being done. The second can be labeled governing, one person controlling another. Since these two, consent and governing, are opposites, the concept of consent of the governed is a contradiction. If there is mutual consent, it is not government. If there is governing, there is no consent. Some will claim that a majority, or the people as a whole, have given their consent to be ruled, even if many individuals have not. But such an argument turns the concept of consent on its head. No one, individually or as a group, can give consent for someone else, for something to be done to someone else. That is simply not what consent means. It defies logic to say, I give my consent for you to be robbed. Yet that is the basis of the cult of democracy, the notion that a majority can give consent on behalf of a minority. That is not consent of the governed. It is forcible control of the governed, with the consent of a third party. Even if someone were silly enough to actually tell someone, I agree to let you forcibly control me, the moment the controller must force the controllee, quote-unquote, to do something, there is obviously no longer consent. Prior to that moment, there is no governing, only voluntary cooperation. Expressing the concept more precisely exposes its inherent schizophrenia. I agree to let you force things upon me, whether I agree to them or not. But in reality, no one ever agrees to let those in government do whatever they want. So, in order to fabricate consent where there is none, believers in authority add another, even more bizarre, step to the mythology. The notion of implied consent. The claim is that by merely living in a town or a state or a country, one is agreeing to abide by whatever rules happen to be issued by the people who claim to have the right to rule that town, state, or country. The idea is that if someone does not like the rules, he is free to leave the town, state, or country altogether, and if he chooses not to leave, that constitutes him giving his consent to be controlled by the rulers of that jurisdiction. Though it is constantly parroted as gospel, the idea defies common sense. It makes no more sense than a carjacker stopping a driver on Sunday and telling him, by driving a car in this neighborhood on a Sunday, you are agreeing to give me your car. One person obviously cannot decide what counts as someone else agreeing to something. An agreement is when two or more people communicate a mutual willingness to enter into some arrangement. Simply being born somewhere is not agreeing to anything, nor is living in one's house when some king or politician has declared it to be within the realm he rules. It is one thing for someone to say, if you want to ride my car, you may not smoke. Or, you can come into my house, only if you take your shoes off. It is quite another to tell other people what they can do on their own property. Whoever has the right to make the rules for a particular place is, by definition, the owner of that place. That is the basis of the idea of private property, that there can be an owner who has the exclusive right to decide what is done with and on that property. The owner of a house has the right to keep others out of it, and, by extension, the right to tell visitors what they can and cannot do as long as they are in the house. And that sheds some light on the underlying assumption behind the idea of implied consent. To tell someone that his only valid choices are to either leave the country or abide by whatever commands the politicians issue logically implies that everything in the country is the property of the politicians. If a person can spend year after year paying for his home or even building it himself and his choices are still either to obey the politicians or to get out, that means his house and the time and effort he invested in the house are the property of the politicians. And for one person's time and effort to rightfully belong to another is the definition of slavery. That is exactly what the implied consent theory means, that every country is a huge slave plantation, and that everything and everyone there is the property of politicians. And of course, the master does not need the consent of his slave. The believers in government never explain how it is that a few politicians could have acquired the right to unilaterally claim exclusive ownership of thousands of square miles of land, where other people were already living, as their territory to rule and exploit as they see fit. It would be no different from a lunatic saying, "I hereby declare North America to be my rightful domain, so anyone living here has to do whatever I say, and if you don't like it, you can leave." There is also a practical problem with the obey or get out attitude, which is that getting out of the country would only relocate the individual to some other giant slave plantation, a different country. The end result is that everyone on Earth is a slave, with the only choice being which master to live under. This completely rules out actual freedom. More to the point, that is not what consent means. The belief that politicians own everything is demonstrated even more dramatically in the concept of immigration laws. The idea that a human being needs permission from politicians to set foot anywhere in an entire country, the notion that it can be a crime for someone to step across an invisible line between one authoritarian jurisdiction into another, implies that the entire country is the property of a ruling class. If a citizen is not allowed to hire an illegal alien, is not allowed to trade with him, is not even allowed to invite an illegal into his own home, then that individual citizen owns nothing, and the politicians own everything. Not only is the theory of implied consent logically flawed, but it obviously does not describe reality. Any government that had the consent of its subjects would not need and would not have law enforcers. Enforcement happens only if someone does not consent to something. Anyone with their eyes open can see that government, on a regular basis, does things to a lot of people against their will. To be aware of the myriad of tax collectors, beat cops, inspectors and regulators, border guards, narcotic agents, prosecutors, judges, soldiers, and all the other mercenaries of the state, is to still claim that government does what it does with the consent of the governed is utterly ridiculous. Each individual, if he is at all honest with himself, knows that those in power do not care whether he consents to abide by their laws. The politicians' orders will be carried out, by brute force if necessary, with or without any individual's consent.